Have you ever wondered how pro sim drivers prepare for a special endurance event? Well, I've spoken with a pro sim driver on exactly what they do, and I'm going to go through everything with you in this video. There's a few different sections that the pro drivers focus on, and you can't really do one before the other. So we're going to go through them in the right order. Naturally, it always starts with some initial practice. A big part of this involves using static conditions. This keeps everything consistent. The more stable you keep everything, the easier it's going to be. Once you've got your conditions, load a setup of your choice. If you don't have one, then picking a standard setup directly from the game is fine. Now what you want to do first is head out and do a short 3 to 5 lap run, which just focuses on your raw pace, and to do a little bit of early setup work. This might seem counterintuitive, but they help the pros work out what feels fastest and which setup direction is working best. It's almost like trying to avoid analysis paralysis. Once they've got the initial data, then they'll start to work on slightly longer runs, anywhere from 10 laps to half a stint. As you can probably guess, this gives them a better understanding of how the car works. Things like how the tyres develop over more laps, not just a brand new set. Then they'll run a full stint. This is where they can get to grips with how the car behaves over a good chunk of time. You've got things like tyre evolution, but also fuel burn, which both have pretty significant effects on the car over an entire stint. This initial practice is really key. But there's something else that the pros are conscious of. Unless you're running a one car class for an endurance event, there's normally lots of different options to choose from in, say, GT3. So how on earth do you choose which car is best? Well, they not only do initial practice with each car, but they focus on a few key factors. The first is raw pace. Simply, which car is fastest over a short run. That's what the drivers notice in their first 3 to 5 laps that they do. Then you've got fuel consumption, which directly affects a stint length and can have pretty huge advantages. Now I'm going to touch on this a little bit more later in the video, so make sure you keep watching. If, say, you've got one car that can go 1 lap longer per stint than the others, that will completely change the race strategy and potentially give you a huge advantage. Then you've got how the car evolves over a run. Now the pros split this into 2 sections: balance and tyre wear. Some cars start really strong but fall off pretty quickly. Others become better as the stint goes on. Sort of related to this is drivability. A car might be fast on paper, but if it's an absolute dog to drive consistently over an entire stint, it might not be the best choice for a 24-hour event. Now this next one might not seem important, but quality performance is another factor. Even in an endurance race, a good starting position can be very, very beneficial, especially when you take into account multi-class traffic. So the pros work on what can give them a strong quali lap. Finally, the pros will be thinking about how good the car will be in the rain. Some cars are simply better in the wet, and predictable cars in the wet can give the team a huge advantage if the weather is likely to change. Alright, so at this point, the pros have got a pretty good understanding of the car and they've done quite a bit of track time. But we're still on static conditions here, which is fine for some initial data, but they need to start prepping for what the race will actually be like. There's a few ways to do this. First, they just load into different conditions. Things like a slightly different wind direction or humidity levels can have a huge effect on the car's balance and grip. Even fuel consumption can drastically differ, but it does make sense. With a tailwind on a long straight, you can save more fuel. There's more potential to lift and coast, and so on. But a headwind will do the opposite. Now the pros won't know exactly what the conditions are going to be like, but they'll jump into official practice sessions to get an understanding. It also gives them a nice chance to get used to managing traffic, which in a 24-hour race, you'll be doing quite a lot. Once they've got all of this data, most pro teams would narrow their choice down to just 2 cars. Now at this point you might be asking, well, why 2? Why not just 1? Well, on occasion, there's some significant balance of performance changes near the race, so having a backup plan last minute can give a little bit of a buffer if the team's number 1 choice is all of a sudden rubbish. The cars they choose normally comes down to the driver preference and drivability. If 2 cars are close in pace, but one feels more predictable over a longer run, that's normally the better choice. This isn't the only thing though. The fuel targets are also very important, and getting it wrong can cost a team over 1 minute right at the very end of the race. Let me explain. Every single team will want to avoid what's called a splash and dash pit stop at the end of a race. The team works out an ideal fuel target based on the pace of the drivers, the race length, and then set a fuel target for the teams to aim for. If one car hits this fuel target easier than the other, that will play a huge factor in the car that they pick. Once the two cars are shortlisted, there's only one thing left to do, which I mentioned briefly earlier on. Over a 6, 12, or even a 24-hour race, weather plays a huge part in the outcome, and teams who practice in the rain will have a huge advantage over others that don't. So what do the pro teams do? Well, similar to when they were getting the initial data, they'll set up a static condition session. Normally moderate moisture and 100% relative humidity. The principle is the same. It helps make the lap times more comparable. Once they have a few laps under their belt, they'll use the timeline weather feature. They'll set the rain to get increasingly heavier every 10 to 15 laps to get a feel for what the cars do in the different rain intensity levels. But obviously, during a race, the track doesn't stay wet all of the time. It will dry if the rain stops, so they'll also do some drying track practice. The pro teams do this a couple of ways. One way pro teams practice for this is to make it rain a couple of hours before the session starts, then stop the rain and leave clear skies for the final hour before the session begins. When the session loads in, the track will typically start in a very lightly wet state, which might mean slick tyres are already an option. This gives the drivers a chance to experiment with switching to slicks on a drying track. Now, it's worth mentioning here that this won't be exactly the same as actual cars drying the track by themselves. That's almost impossible to simulate, but it gets reasonably close. Another scenario pro teams try is starting an overcast but dry session, and then using the timeline weather and then letting the rain start during the run. This lets them work out how long they can stay on slick tyres before the track becomes undrivable. Sometimes this can give you a big strategic advantage, but there's also an argument for pitting in earlier if the track is getting wet. By switching to wet tyres sooner, you can warm them up on a less saturated track, which makes building temperature easier and reduces the risk of losing control. This is just one part of what pro drivers do that you can do as well to make you faster. And you can find out the other reasons as to why they are as fast as they are by clicking on this video here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.